Okay, welcome and thank you very much for coming for the last Dean's Lecture of the series this year, 2018. Wow, the year's disappearing quickly. Before I get to Amanda, let me please acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri and the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders both past, present and emerging. And it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to welcome Professor Amanda Berg. I have a script here, but you would have all read it because it's the abstract of what's going on. And actually, I rarely read the abstracts out loud, but this one did capture my attention. And it captured my attention because down near the bottom it says, STEM education. This is a challenging situation which opens up an important moment for teachers as agents of educational innovation. Now, I'm hoping that Amanda spends a lot of time on that particular line in her presentation tonight.
Thanks for the pressure.
Because I think it's really interesting that, as her abstract says, there's a whole lot of things going on around STEM as an idea. What does it mean to be concrete in the classroom is another world. So I'm hoping that there's some slide or two on that, Mandy. But beyond the actual presentation, I do want to make really clear how fortunate we are at Monash to have Mandy here as a Professor of STEM Education, the first and only Professor of STEM Education in the faculty. And she comes with a great pedigree. She spent some time at Leiden University, a wonderful university, and she has grown unbelievably strong at the international profile in her work. When she came back to Australia, she worked at RMIT for a while, and then we were so lucky that she accepted an opportunity to come here, and we've been grateful for that ever since. As you will hear from her tonight, not only is she an incredibly intelligent, capable and thoughtful person.
Sorry, okay. I'm not laughing. Right.
Intelligent, capable, thoughtful, caring, understanding, and unbelievable teacher. And all of those things are exactly the same for her scholarship and her ability to present ideas and put them out in ways that invite us into the challenge that's associated with that work. That's the type of thing that matters in education. That's the type of thing that really matters in the notion of scholarship in universities. And so, Mandy, we couldn't be happier than to have you here doing the last Dean's Lecture series of this year and being able to celebrate the sharing of good ideas and pushing back a little bit on our thinking and our ways of understanding STEM education. So thank you, Mandy.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John. It is very special because not only is it the last Dean's Lecture Series, but it's the last Dean's Lecture Series for you, John, as retiring Dean of our faculty. And I say that because a long time ago, and I won't tell you how many years, John and I actually taught over the road from each other in Windsor, John at the boys' school and me at the girls' school. And I used to go over there on a Friday afternoon because they had beer in their fridge and we didn't. And so it's been fantastic to have this journey together as we've moved through teaching careers into academia, but always keeping that focus on teachers as professionals and valuing the work of teachers. And that's what motivated the focus of the lecture this evening for me, is around hearing a lot about STEM education for industry and government and maybe schools and learners, but what about teachers in all of this? And so that's the idea that I want to try and unpack a bit with you tonight and hopefully give you some things to think about. And I also want to say, I know that there's people in the room. Thank you very much for coming. There are also people online. I believe people internationally online, so I feel very special about having those people with us too. So thanks very much. And in Peninsula as well, which is a bit of an innovation for us. Now I'm sticking my microphone thing down here so I don't fall off, negotiating all these various bits and pieces. And at this point in time, I want you to imagine some dramatic music Insert dramatic music now. I didn't put any in, so you just have to imagine it. Because this is music that we're in a crisis, right in the middle of a crisis. It's a STEM crisis, and we should be panicking. And if we're not panicking, you should start panicking now. And we know it's a crisis because we keep seeing these words all over the media all the time being repeated about this urgency, crisis, problem. How are we dealing with it? It's not just Australia, it's a global issue. And many recent reports in Australia, and they just keep coming, are about Australia facing severe future skill shortages in the STEM fields, and we're losing ground in terms of our international economic competitiveness. And that same kind of discourse of crisis and urgency is pervading all of that kind of talk, including Australia's declining performance in international comparisons of achievement. And we're slipping down compared to where we should be if we were doing a good job in Australia to do something about this STEM crisis, whatever it happens to be. And further fuel for this crisis comes from the notion of what's happening at student level in schools. And so this report comes from the Office of the Chief Scientist in 2017 that shows participation of Australian school students in Year 12 in science and maths. And so we can see overall participation is declining for science, although I notice earth science happens to be increasing. And though I don't believe it's actually a VCE subject, it's in other states. And the same within mathematics, except entry-level mathematics seems to be increasing. Only 1 in 10 students completes advanced maths in Year 12. And not only that, is that kids actually don't start school really thinking science or maths is terrific, and they lose interest rapidly, it seems, between primary and secondary school. And so not only are we not competitive, not only is our future threatened, is that we don't even have people taking up these subjects in school, adding to this particular problem. So we're just not panicking enough, apparently. And there was a report in 2013 of the STEM country comparisons that was put out by the Australian Councils of Learned Academies, who told us that in world terms, Australia is positioned not far below the top group, but we lack the national urgency found in other countries, and we run the risk of being left behind. So again, you notice that kind of language, the way it's framed, and the way in which we're led to think about our global competitiveness. And you might have also noticed in The Age a couple of weeks ago that if that was 2013, in 2018, we've still got a continuing poor performance, and our STEM subjects and our poor performance threatens the country's economic future. And for those chemists amongst you, perhaps if this diagram is supposed to represent accurate chemistry, that might be one reason why we're having a problem in STEM. So, don't know what school that the reporter went to. Okay, so all of that sort of preamble is about setting the scene in relation to this thing that might be called a global STEM phenomenon that is also infecting Australia and has rolled on into the Australian context as well. And there's a lot of text here that I'll take you through, but this is something that many of you may already know has been driven from outside of education. So it's come from economic, political agendas about improving vocational and economic goals, and about ways in which it's been represented and mobilised in Australia and Western countries. And Blackley and Hal have a nice article about the STEM narrative in Australia. And it tends to get framed in terms of the supply of human capital for their enterprise society. So the ways in which we're preparing workers for the future, and particular kinds of workers for a particular kind of future. And as Lynn Carter talks about, it tends to be represented in this sort of crisis discourse, and as a consequence, then gets pushed onto education to do something about. So this very ill-defined problem for educators that then they're expected to be able to respond to. And partly the ways in which those proposed solutions are put forward are we need more science, technology, engineering, mathematics in schools. Mind you, we don't actually have engineering in schools in Australia at the moment. And we also need more content mastery for students. So we need to be able to achieve in these international tests. That means that we need more students who know their stuff. And we also need more teachers who know the content in high-level ways in order to be able to promote that learning. So I'm not saying that we don't need teachers who have high-level learning, but what I am saying is that the kind of learning that teachers have is more than being experts in their subject matter. And you could have noticed various initiatives in different countries around the world and in Australia about bringing smart people into teaching and not actually focusing on what it means to teach kids things, but about just having that wealth of high-level content knowledge that somehow they're supposed to be able to raise the achievement levels of the students. So it's in this kind of a climate that these things, these proposed solutions exist. And similarly, there are proposed solutions about who else can come in and support or fix our STEM crisis. And I'm going to show you a map that is not of a train system, even though it looks like one. So this was recently put out by the chief scientists of Victoria, the lead scientists of Victoria, I should say. And this is a map of all the STEM initiatives for Victoria that are being carried out outside of schools at the moment. So, I mean, it's fantastic to see this array of different kinds of activities and different kinds of availabilities, but it also shows you what kind of a space STEM is in terms of the sorts of things that are being offered. And it doesn't necessarily point to what is quality or how to select from those things, but it shows you about the increasing kinds of ways in which external agencies are starting to take their place in schools. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but a thing that we need to be mindful of as we consider what is the role of teachers in STEM education. And so as I was thinking about these various kinds of ideas around competition and achievement and outside market forces, etc., from STEM, and it reminded me of what some of you might know in terms of Pasi Sahlberg's germ ideas. It's global education reform movements. And Sahlberg talks about this idea of the globalisation of education and how ideas move across different national and international boundaries. And typically those ideas tend to standardise and kind of homogenise educational practices and policies. And so education reform is often related to raising economic competitiveness, and so these kinds of germs, these global education reform movements around policy and curriculum tend to take on a life of their own. And so some of the elements that actually characterise this notion of germ refer to standardisation. So, and remember, I'm a sort of biologist, so I know that some germs are good and other germs are bad. So there has been some kind of talk around, not everything that's germ is bad in terms of, for instance, focusing on students in their learning compared with only a focus on teachers in their teaching. But if we have a think about notions such as standardisation, all students should be educated to the same ambitious learning targets, regardless of context, which can lead to particular kinds of prescribed curriculum and uniform education policies. Emphasis on core subjects, so increasing emphasis on literacy, mathematics and science typically, and spending more time in class on these things and making them the prime targets of national improvement, and those things increasingly influenced by international assessment measures. So that kind of emphasis there. And it's interesting as I go around and talk with teachers, particularly primary teachers, about how they're managing STEM in their schools, and they say sometimes we don't have time because we've got the literacy block and the numeracy block and it doesn't leave time for doing those other things, perhaps different in secondary. And this idea of corporate models and corporate partners. So bringing in management models within schools, in the ways that schools are organised, in thinking about increased competitiveness within and amongst schools, opening access to schools from new kinds of players. You saw that map before, and the ways in which reform gets driven by ideas that come from outside of education. So it's that thing of thinking around what do these things actually do when you're considering the influence on teachers and their ability to be able to operate in their classrooms, to do the things with their students in their contexts that matter for them. And so one of the outcomes that people have been writing about and discussing in terms of germ is that it can lead to a devaluing of the professional expertise of teachers. If things are being externally controlled, if there's a set curriculum, if there are particular targets, it makes it very difficult for teachers who want to be able to experiment with their practice, for instance, who want to be able to take risks, who want to be able to do something different. And one of the kind of amusing things about playing with this idea is, how do you learn to protect yourself against these kinds of germs that might be infecting the system? So again, it's not necessarily that's what's happening with STEM, but I feel that the potential there in terms of the kind of reductive definitions of STEM that are possible if we imagine that kind of ways of thinking about competitiveness, achievement and economic success can lead to these kinds of things that we should be wary of. And so that sort of leads into my central idea here, that if we buy into a crisis discourse, then we start to narrow the possibilities for how schools and teachers can interpret STEM for the full benefit of all learners. And I want to argue for a more expansive view of STEM, and one that engages teachers as active professionals in interpreting and implementing STEM education in their contexts for their students, and the ways in which they can enact that with professional agency, you might say, and how that could be supported. And again, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be preparing students for the world of work and we shouldn't be preparing people for jobs, but if we only do that, if that's where our major focus is, then I think we do ourselves a disservice, we do students a disservice, and we certainly restrict the opportunities for good education and for the work of good teachers, as we know. Okay, so if that's a sort of setting up of the framing of this idea of STEM as crisis discourse, these are ideas around, what is driving this externally, then what does it look like in schools? What's happening in schools that might be able to reflect some of this? And so I did a bit of a search around different school websites and have a look at what's going on. And it seems that schools seem to be keen to brand themselves somehow as STEM schools. So they want to show that they're responding to this particular environment and the sorts of initiatives that they have from, STEM at our school, about robots and technology and bringing those sorts of things and making sure the minister is there, and running STEM festivals, and investing a lot of money, some very elaborate STEM centres that we've seen in Melbourne that are being built, a lot of money that's being invested in those particular areas in order to show, interesting situation of wanting to show themselves as STEM schools, and who can blame them? This is the reality of what you need to be responding to. But on the other hand, when you look at the job vacancies for teachers, it seems that the silos of the individual disciplines are still very, very much entrenched. So again, I did a bit of a look through the age of a few weeks, and typical ads here about physics and mathematics teachers and maths and science teachers. And I also did a hunt through seek.com looking for classroom teacher jobs, and you see these basically a month apart. And there are a couple of STEM jobs that are advertised. I've got the S and the P there because one of them in a secondary and one of them in a primary school. When you look at the job description, it just says needs to be able to teach STEM. So that's not entirely helpful. But anyway, it leaves space for you to put in anything you want on your CV, I guess. Whereas, typically maths, science, technology teachers, there was one engineering job. Actually, it was part of a Year 12 systems engineering for technology, I think, to be filled. So here we've got this kind of interesting dichotomy on the one hand between wanting to be seen as responding to the STEM agenda, and yet schools themselves organised in a way that tend to represent the individual silos of the STEM disciplines. And again, how can you blame schools? This is the reality of what things are like for them. And particularly when you also realise that there's no official subject in school called STEM. There's nothing within the curriculum that is STEM. There are particular capabilities that go across different areas, but there's no official place for a thing called STEM that currently exists. So schools are trying to manage something, again, as I said, that has been imposed upon them and that they need to somehow make sense of. And it does offer interesting possibilities within the kind of constructs and boundaries of schools themselves. So that sets up a particular challenge. And there's a lovely quote I'm going to put up here from Linda Hobbs and colleagues at Deakin about these kind of elements that are the components of the challenge, I would say. So I'll read it out because I think it's pretty nice. So the challenge for educators is to translate an ill-defined, politically charged and narrowly utilitarian policy agenda of securing a future workforce into a valid and coherent curriculum that addresses the subtle and complex challenge of preparing 21st century citizens within the constraints of a traditional school system. So I see these really interesting elements here, that ill-defined, politically charged, what's come from outside and is mobilised around politics and economy, changing that into something that is a valid and coherent curriculum for particular schools, that idea of preparing future citizens, what does that mean, moral, responsible future citizens, and within a traditional school system. And so you think of what are the kinds of ways in which schools are organised according to subject boundaries, the school day and how it's organised, the elements of the curriculum, the parent expectations, teachers' expectations. And so all of these kind of factors are in tension with each other as these STEM initiatives are being talked about, are being tried to be understood within the context of schools for something that can be purposeful and meaningful for the people who are working in them and for the people whose lives they are shaping in the future. So, of course, part of my job here is to think about what is an alternative way of thinking about STEM education. What could an alternative conception look like that starts to open up or broaden the possibilities if I'm saying that these other ones are about narrowing or limiting opportunities? So STEM education, I'm saying, could include a wider set of purposes to reflect the changing nature of the STEM disciplines to begin with. If we think about the ways in which the disciplines of the individual disciplines and their crossovers work, and you think about what's happening in schools currently, then the parallel is, quite wide. Reflect the contemporary skills and practices of different kinds of STEM professionals. What is it that people are actually doing in the world of STEM, and how might we be able to draw on some of those in ways that are fruitful and useful in schools, and address the needs and concerns and interests of diverse learners for ways in which is considered responsible participation. So just want to illustrate some of those ideas with some pretty pictures. And so in terms of the changing nature of disciplines and their connections, it's really interesting when you start to look at what kind of the insides of disciplines, what new disciplines look like, what connections between them also look like. So for instance, as a biology person, then I know now that there's biomathematics, there's biotechnology, of course, bioengineering, and these different kinds of fields that have merged together. within biology itself, there are smaller subdisciplines that have become their own fields. For example, something called proteomics, which is the study of sets of proteins within particular organisms, so going deeper and specialised as well as cross boundaries. Boundaries between different kinds of subjects. For instance, I know that at Leiden University there's a subject called econophysics that's taught, and that is about applying the laws of physics to the financial markets. So, these interesting kinds of mergers between different disciplinary areas and different kinds of nature of discipline, that if you think about the sorts of things that are being taught at school, probably don't reflect those kinds of differences and changes. The same as what learning looks like. So if we think a traditional learning model is more about a hierarchy where you have somebody who has the good oil or who holds that knowledge and then imparts it to others. Learning looks very different, and if you work with kids, you know that learning looks very different now these days in terms of where the kinds of networks that kids access, various types of people. It's not just kind of from one particular source, and the ways in which that relational, networked, different kinds of communities, decentralised, non-hierarchical, and again, what does that look like in schools when we compare that to the nature of the ways in which we represent or enact learning with kids in schools? And the same with that idea about the changing nature of STEM professionals. And that illustration is meant to show about people coming together, typically working in teams around more complex problems, bringing in ideas from different disciplinary areas and learning to speak in ways that can cut across those areas in order to be able to work on problems together. And so if we think about this alternate conception of STEM, and we think about the ways in which schooling is typically going on, then I think there's a strong disconnect, although I do know that there are schools and teachers who are working hard to try to implement different kinds of visions of STEM that is not connected to that particular narrow one that I mentioned before. So especially, I think, in secondary schools, there's this notion of a kind of strictly bounded, locked into, potentially rather anachronistic subject matter, and that opportunities to open that up then become important, but also set up some challenges for teachers and schools in terms of what it might mean if you're a teacher working in this kind of a situation. So what might this conception of STEM education mean for schools and teachers if you would take on the ideas that I've just been mentioning? Well, shifts in conceptions of what constitutes subject matter. Particularly, I think, in terms of secondary teachers and the traditions that I've come from, in terms of what makes up a subject, and intimately connected, I think, to people's sense of their identity as a teacher. Who you are is often connected to what it is that you teach, and sometimes how you teach it as well. And so if we were to embrace a kind of alternative way of thinking about STEM, this would require these kinds of shifts. In terms of professional expertise, well, from being somebody who holds information and is able to deal that out to students, to thinking about ways in which you're acting as a co-learner, or how you might facilitate learning across 20 different projects happening in your classroom around different kinds of topics. And so that, and intimately, I think, connected with that sense of identity, professional expertise, and then what that might mean in terms of what it looks like for pedagogy, for curriculum design overall, for assessment, and the ways in which the conception of STEM education might start to shift these sorts of activities and practices. And also what we would need to be able to create opportunities and conditions for teacher learning if we wanted to embrace these particular ideas. So what would it mean for schools to be places where teachers could take on these and the shifts that could be involved? So as I said before, there are some places that I know that are already doing terrific work, and they're already working on these things, and teachers who are doing amazing things despite the vagueness, despite all the kinds of pressures that are happening amongst them. And I'm going to show you a video now, and I'm saying thank you to Greg and to Lucas because this video is actually shot yesterday, so it's very fresh. And this is an example from Michelle Verner at St Gregory's in primary school in Doncaster, and she's talking about. She's the principal of the school, and she's talking about some of the shifts in thinking and the ways in which she's working with her staff around changes in thinking. So I'm going to go like that, and I hope that means the video is going to start.
The way children engage in education, there's more collaboration, investigation, dialogue with each other. It looks different in a classroom in comparison to, traditional maths lessons where children are just doing activity sheets or science lessons where just experiments. It looks different. So with that, I had to work with my staff in looking at how they can look at the change of pedagogy in the way they approached it as well. To that, there was a discussion with my staff about do you agree that STEM education is important for our students today in their learning? And they all did. They all agreed. They could see our world is changing. They could see how children are learning differently. So they took time to reflect on themselves as learners, and probably that's been my initial mantra in coming to the school. I've said to the teachers that I see myself as a learner and that I expect my staff to see themselves as learners. So with that, they've taken it on with gusto and have tried to get their head around it themselves. But I'm a big believer that as a principal, you can't just assume that your teachers are going to go and take it on. It's about creating the environment for them as learners. So if it means introducing techie brekkies once a week to improve their digital technology skills, or if it means trialling things from professional reading. So the expectation is they've read the article, they've brought some notes in, there's been dialogue and discussion, but it's also a commitment in the level to say, look, let's trial it this week and let's come back next week and see how did it go. And the other thing I found too is almost incidental, where they're learning from each other. So I would say that the changing of practice is something that is pertinent, but you can't just assume that it's going to happen.
Nice. I didn't know what a techie brekkie was, but I think I know now. You get to learn how pieces of technology work. So the kinds of things that Michelle talks about are pretty special in terms of what's going on in her school. It's a primary school. I would be interested to know whether that kind of approach is also happening in secondary schools. I'm sure it may well be, but I think sometimes the opportunities for doing this work in primary schools can be a little bit more open. But you need people like that who are prepared to bring their ideas in and from an organisational level, from a school level, start to support and encourage and value that, which is really important. Okay, so I come to the role of STEM professor with a long background in teacher learning and development. And so I look into my past and say, what is it that I bring from my experience that can help to inform the ways in which I'm talking about STEM education here and the ways in which we want to potentially support STEM education. And so from the many projects that I've been involved in, I decided to choose just 4 to highlight, to think about the sorts of things that have come out of those in terms of teacher learning outcomes and what that might imply for working with teachers around this STEM agenda. And back in the old days when I was working as a teacher in the classroom, I was also researching my practice. I've been working with teachers, researching their practice, working in professional learning situations here in Netherlands and in a range of places. And I feel very privileged to have that opportunity and to be able to think along with teachers about their own learning and their own development. And so the 4 that I'm going to be talking about is a Mohnish Project, a long project around developing science teachers' professional knowledge of practice, around pre-service teachers as STEM educators, supporting teacher learning about inquiry, and finally one around teacher educators, taking a little shift towards those people who teach prospective teachers and the kinds of secret story knowledge that they hold. So I've got some photos here because it's nice to acknowledge that the team that you've worked with over the years. And so John, our Dean, and Pam Mulhall and Pippa Milroy, Dick Gunston, when I first began at Monash, we began this project that has become a multi-year international project around working on the specialised knowledge that teachers develop that enables them to be able to organise and represent their subject so that it's learnable by students, so that it's comprehensible by students. And the idea of valuing teachers and their knowledge was very much underpinning this project right from the beginning. And knowing that to be an expert teacher, it requires a complex knowledge base. That is, more than just being an expert in the content, there are many different kinds of knowledge that you need to be able to bring together in a way that supports learners and that bringing it together in ways that enable the learners that you have in this place at that time to be able to effectively understand what it is that are the learning goals. And so the thing is that as you progress as a teacher, much of that knowledge becomes embodied. So over time, with experience, you figure out how some of these things work. But it's not typical that you have an opportunity to be able to share that knowledge with others, to talk about it, especially the ways in which schools are organised. Typically, you're much more busy doing things than you are about articulating your knowledge of practice. That's something that more often happens at university. And as a consequence, what happens is that the professional knowledge of teachers often goes unseen because they're busy doing it, undervalued because for themselves even they're doing it and not talking about, and increasingly then from outside the profession, undervalued of teachers' knowledge because there are not those opportunities to be able to show and share what it is that teachers know that is their particular kind of expertise. And so the motivation behind this project came from, like, what could we do? How could we try to capture and document and portray this kind of specialised knowledge of practice? And for us, it was around science teachers that might be valid and useful and usable for the profession. And so this concept of PCK, pedagogical content knowledge, framed this longitudinal research program, and as I say, still going, and we're lucky to have Janet here from Stanford who's been working with us in PCK over the years as well. And through this particular project, what we came to identify and what we came to develop working with teachers around their practice was particular tools for unpacking their knowledge of practice. So over time, and as we talked with teachers about what are the big ideas that you're trying to help learners to be able to understand as part of your subject, and what are the ways in which you support learners to be able to understand those, we built up these particular scaffolds or tools and that enabled teachers to, the teachers that we're working with, to develop this kind of language of practice that became really important, so shared knowledge, a shared language of practice, and also to start to recognise their own knowledge, recognise that they did have this kind of specialised knowledge, and through knowing it and articulating it, able to more easily, more ably develop it. And so that also serving as mediating for conversations between teachers, that they could start to have more focused conversations around the things that were supporting learners. What are the means of assessing student learning? How do you know if a student actually gets an idea? What do you see? And how is that connected to the particular content and the particular pedagogical approach, the instructional approach that you choose to connect these? And I think what's been really important about this is the raising up of the status of teachers' professional knowledge by making it explicit in these ways. And we have a number of publications that come from this project that have tried to capture and represent for the profession this kind of knowledge. Importantly, though, this is not supposed to represent the ultimate knowledge base that everybody then can go and say, great, this is what teachers, everybody should know what's in this book. It's more about the process of coming together around particular ways of thinking and unpacking practice that give those kinds of structures to teachers and enable them to think about the elements that comprise their professional knowledge. And well, we've worked with people in-service teachers around these particular ideas, and also I've worked with Anne Hume from New Zealand around a project where we were using these particular tools as conversational tools, if you like, between pre-service teachers and their mentors in order to be able to have more sophisticated conversations about practice compared to what am I going to do tomorrow in the class and which kid is not going to behave. And so these pre-service teachers themselves found it was a much more satisfying way to be able to think and talk about their purposes and to start to recognise their own professional strengths. And so on the next slide, I've got a quote that comes from a teacher educator in Canberra who we're working with, Jim Molno, who was also using these particular tools with the student teachers in his classes, and the way he came to recognise what this potentially offered. So he says, looking into teaching through this type of PCK lens is important, because if you think about it, there's a problem of perception about what the job of teaching entails, and there needs to be a mechanism for teachers to talk about and to sustain their thinking about teaching and learning in science. And I really like that for that notion of the problem of perception actually is one that is experienced by many beginning teachers when they come in. They think really it's about being able to get the activities that'll help them to be successful in the classroom. And the problem of perception externally as well, from the public, from other politicians, about what the job of teaching entails. And to start to empower these young teachers with ways of thinking about what they're doing as complex, sophisticated practice became really important, and a very strong learning experience for this teacher educator in framing the way that he went about his particular approach to teaching these to student teachers, and in terms of their expectations and understandings of teaching. So that was the first example. So the second example comes from a project much more recently at RMIT before I came back to Monash, and it was a project that we called STEM in situ. And the project aimed to develop pre-service teachers, science teachers, knowledge and understanding of contemporary STEM contexts and their pedagogies through participation in a mentoring initiative for schoolgirls. So it's kind of complicated in the different people who were coming together. But in the project, we had primary and secondary pre-service teachers who volunteered to work as mentors, and they collaborated in the design of learning experiences for upper primary, lower secondary school-aged girls, together with teacher educators and researchers in STEM at RMIT. And the idea was to start to expose these pre-service teachers to what contemporary STEM looked like. So, for instance, they were working in nanotechnology, advanced manufacturing, robotics, and virtual technologies, and to help them to start to build some confidence in themselves in how they interacted in these spaces and how they started to connect ideas about different fields of STEM with learning experiences that were suitable for these kinds of girls, and how they worked also with the teachers. So, as I said, it was kind of a complicated number of groups, but we think it was very valuable. So, working with Tricia McLaughlin and Grant Cooper, and some of the outcomes in terms of this project, I mean, none of these students had any familiarity with these kinds of fields before, so that was good in terms of their exposure to this kind of new and variable content. Something that was interesting to us was this idea of the students really enjoying working together in designing the lessons, because they were team teaching and they were co-designing, but also designing together with the STEM specialists and the school teachers when they were available. And so challenging that notion of the teacher as a lone worker, which often, especially in secondary settings, can be a prevailing kind of norm. So for them, it became their new norm to be working together. Again, it was a low-stakes environment because it was a volunteer program, and so they weren't being assessed formally, so that opportunities to be able to experiment with things were more open. But what I found really interesting was this recognition of the important value of teacher knowledge. The girls initially, so our STEM mentors, the pre-service teachers, were rather hesitant and quite passive when it came to working with the STEM specialists. And they tended to always defer to them, partly, there's a different power relationship there, but also I think they felt that they didn't have very much to offer. But when actually they saw these STEM specialists in action, and these people were talking at quite a high level to these girls, they started to realise, hey, actually, as a teacher, I have a job that can be very helpful in terms of identifying when kids are struggling with particular ideas, of stepping in and supporting with different kinds of learning activities or explanations, or encouraging kids to frame questions that may be helpful for their own understanding. And so you saw them move, because they went through several iterations in this role, and you saw them move to recognising their own expertise, or recognising the beginnings of their own expertise and their contribution of what was particularly important for being a teacher in this situation. And because they were there more often than the school teachers, they had the chance to be able to do this work more. Of course, there were various challenges. Just being able to get everybody together in the same place and time was very, very challenging. And also working with the schools in terms of the availability. And as I've kind of hinted at already, that power position of the pre-service teachers working with the STEM specialists or also working in schools was something that they had to learn to negotiate, and it didn't always work out particularly well for them. I'm pleased to say a number of them were employed in the schools that they were doing the work in. However, there's also that kind of lingering thought that you have this experience, but what actually happens when you get out into the world of schools, and the kind of institutional culture that can push against these kinds of experiences. So, this is a short-term kind of intervention, and it would be interesting to know about what happens when those people are in schools, and particularly in schools that have participated in the program. But it's difficult from a pre-service perspective then. It's difficult as you're starting to think about the relationship between supporting pre-service teachers to take on new ways of thinking and having new experiences, and then moving into school cultures where that may push back against that. So, what do you do? Well, you have a principal like Michelle Verner, I guess that can help. So the third example that I want to talk about is another project that I had with Pam relatively recently about supporting teacher learning around inquiry. And this was part of a bigger project around a framework called Curiosity and Powerful Learning that you may have heard of. But one component of it was about introducing more inquiry practices in schools to support student learning. And what we were interested to find out about was, what do teachers do when they have the opportunity to support their own professional learning in schools? How do they help each other to learn about this? So there was no kind of prescription about what should be done. There was this broad overarching framework, but schools were free to decide how they would support, through their learning leaders, other teachers learning about inquiry. So there were both primary schools and secondary schools who were part of a network, and that because they had this sort of shared focus on inquiry, that was important because that connected them. But they did have freedom over what it was that they chose to do, and different schools interpreted this in different ways. But the idea was that they would come to some kind of shared understandings about inquiry. And we talked with these learning leaders about what were the kinds of things that they were noticing in terms of shifts around teacher thinking and teacher practices. And here's some of the things that they told us. And I love this first quote. I think one of the big mental shifts for teachers, so in shifting to an inquiry approach, more open approach, is to be prepared to release control in the classroom and in the lesson. You can only increase student agency, in a sense, by limiting your own. It's a very insightful way of thinking about, that relationship between what you're doing as a teacher and what you're kind of sharing or giving up, and how you negotiate that with students. The second quote refers to this whole school priority, that the school decided it was going to be important that noise wasn't a signal of things going wrong in a classroom. And so this learning leader said, we want teachers not to feel that they'll be judged if there's noise in their class is looking active and someone walks past it. Because there was a fear that if the principal walked past and there was a noisy class, they would be seen as out of control, and they didn't want to take that risk. And interestingly, that was for both beginning teachers and experienced teachers starting to take on new ways of working. So they had decided that it was a whole school priority, that they would not, a noisy classroom would be okay. And, it sounds like a pretty straightforward thing to do, but I think it's quite scary when you're trying to do that work yourself, and it's your class that is quite noisy. And then the final idea here, teachers need to know that they're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. I think if you're not comfortable learning yourself, this is not going to work. So there's something there about making that shift in stance between accepting that you're a co-learner with students and really accepting that. Because again, I think that's one of those things that's very easy to say but can be quite difficult to enact. And making sure that how you think about yourself with students becomes an important part. And again, not everybody is prepared or able or ready or interested to make those kinds of shifts. But this was the sort of things that they were grappling with that I think are really important. And so some of the outcomes of that project then, and relating it to those ideas that I'm talking about earlier in terms of teacher shifts and changes, it sounds like a no-brainer, but it's really important. Learning to teach differently requires experimentation and takes time. It takes more than time, but it certainly takes time, and things look different over different periods of time as well. And the teachers talked with us they said it's a different kind of know-how than regular teaching. It's a different kind of way of operating in the classroom that you need to understand and to get a feel for, and you have to keep getting a feel for it because it doesn't come straight away. And sometimes it's only through experiencing these kind of changed ways of working or experiencing with somebody else that it gives you the opportunity to be able to start to make those changes yourself. But feeling, it becomes a really important part of the change. Again, not wanting to homogenise a definition of inquiry, but saying that there are multiple fruitful ways of thinking about this, but it's important that we do have some kinds of shared understandings around this notion so that we can communicate with each other as a school or as partners across different schools, and that becomes essential if we're going to talk about moving towards particular learning goals. Again, this notion of supportive school leadership, thinking about what Michelle said earlier, and both formal and informal support. So structures there that enable teachers to be able to get together, thinking about the ways in which curriculum is structured and time, and also having the development of a stance towards practice. I think that was a really interesting idea that people talked about. If you're not, and it goes back to that previous slide, if you're not thinking about yourself as a learner, then it's unlikely that it'll be easy for you to take on these particular ideas. Okay, and the last one, as I said, is a little bit different, and this is work that I've done with Rachel Forgas here in the Faculty of Education over previous years. And what we've become particularly interested in, and is a parallel to what's happening in schools, is the ways in which structural reforms are not only reshaping education in schools, but also reshaping teacher education. So in terms, for example, of the teacher professional standards, how we think about those 7 standard and 36 focus areas that now are guiding what is actually happening with the ways in which teacher educators do their work, and what kinds of constraints and opportunities that teacher educators have to be able to enact their own professional knowledge of practice. And one of the things that we were becoming quite aware of in this kind of compliance and accountability environment for teacher educators was the ways in which teacher educators were being positioned more around being technicians and made accountable through these various external measures. And our concern, and it echoes back to the sorts of things that I talked about earlier in relation to that germ theory, was the deprofessionalisation of teaching that comes, and fewer opportunities to be able to do things that are relevant for this group of learners in this context at this time because of their particular needs, for instance. And the work that we were doing was around, how do we mobilise teacher educators around being able to start to look into their own knowledge of practice, and to be able to articulate that practice and research that practice and publish that and make it publicly available as a way of kind of pushing back against these sort of sacred stories, new sacred stories of what education should look like. So we call these secret stories that should be made public because they're often the kinds of stories that get told between teachers in private places, teacher educators, maybe in the staff room, maybe with a friend, but need to be made public in order for that to have an impact back on the profession as knowledge and as recognised knowledge of teachers, and to do that in systematic ways. And so these ideas here of, what were our secret lived stories? We talked to other teacher educators in other institutions about the kinds of things that were their secret stories and what they felt that they were, the tensions that they were experiencing. And in terms of the kind of interesting place that you occupy as an educator, and it's not different in a school, I don't think, between being an agent of socialisation, taking somebody into the profession, as well as being a change agent yourself and asking questions about those the very nature of that socialisation. And sometimes that means that those different expressions of agency of the educator, whoever that happens to be, can stand in tension with one another. And whether it's experience or insight or particular kind of expertise, some people are able to better manage those tensions and navigate around those barriers than others. And that can be important when we're thinking about the ways in which we have to manage an inevitable accountability environment in a way, and also being able to exercise professional agency and professional decision making as educators with specialised knowledge that is important to recognise and to use. Okay, so summing up, so that's 4 examples that I chose to try to highlight some aspects of that teacher learning and change that have been important for me through my research career. And so what are some of the sorts of things here that I think are valuable? Well, I think the message is pretty clear over again about the importance of recognising teachers as both knowledgeable and knowledge producers, and that coming across from the feelings of teachers themselves as well as from externally. And that expanded notions of practice. Practice isn't just about, collections of activities, but ways in which the ideas of practice is something complex and sophisticated, but also contingent and collaborative become. This is a changing environment, and how do you start to recognise this kind of change in the ways in which you work and the kinds of things you're teaching and the opportunities for learning. Obviously, there's a need for opportunities and support to be able to work together, and a clear commitment by schools and teachers to work in these ways. And I think that ultimately, that from these kinds of examples, is around developing a stance towards the self as professional and towards practice, and as a learner, as open to these experiences and to thinking about things rather than in a fixed and rigid kind of way, and imagining how you might respond as a professional in these situations. So I don't know how my time is going, but I'm nearly all right, I'm nearly there. Okay. So getting back to the question that actually started the whole thing, we've gone around here from that sort of macro perspective of the notion of STEM being imposed onto teachers and schools as a problem to be solved, and then thinking about what it might mean if you shift from that sense of a narrow accountability and achievement sense to something that is broader, and then thinking about that idea of, yes, so what does that mean for teachers? And I'm going to paraphrase distinguished colleague Lee Schulman when he was talking about PCK recently in terms of saying there's going to be more than one legitimate and fruitful way of thinking about STEM education. I don't think that we should be constraining ourselves to thinking about what STEM education is as just one particular thing, and that we should all be moving towards it. And my concern is, whether those germ ideas, or we start to standardise those notions of what STEM might be. I think there are multiple ways and multiple fruitful ways of thinking about could it be, and it can look different at different times and in different places for different students. And that's an important element that should be maintained and preserved. And that teachers, educators need an open and flexible approach to how the notion of STEM is evolving. And I guess I'm not saying that let 1,000 flowers bloom, that everybody goes off and does their own thing. there should be some kind of overarching framework that helps us to be able to understand, and thinking about those notions from the Science Teachers Professional Project that I talked about earlier, some kind of ways of kind of bringing together a frame that underpins this work, but not so much that it divests of its life and homogenises it across the country, if not the globe. And my argument then is, if this is the kind of ideas about STEM education that really matter, we need even more knowledgeable teachers who are able to work in these ways, teachers who are able to respond flexibly to these situations, who have the knowledge to bring to bear in the situations where they're working with different kinds of learners around different kinds of problems, around different kinds of content. And that expertise that I talked about becomes even more refined, even greater in that need to be able to work in these ways that embrace this notion of STEM education. And so going along with that is that idea of professional trust. We need to be able to ensure that we have opportunities for teachers to develop in the ways that we can be assured that they will be able to operate and do those things in open, flexible ways. And that professional trust becomes a very important point. And finally, that need for capacity building and sustained organisational support. So within a school, within a system, within the organisations too. Finally, if I was going to think about some questions that might lead a STEM agenda for the future, how might this STEM agenda serve as an enabling mechanism for teachers to act as agents of pedagogical innovation and transformation within the classrooms and communities? So how might it act as an enabling mechanism? And here, this idea of innovation and change. How might STEM serve as an enabling mechanism for teachers to better understand their own professional knowledge and the role of their knowledge in supporting student and learning in STEM? So kind of that shift of idea of professional knowledge. And finally, how might STEM serve to enhance teacher professional knowledge through collaboration between teachers and other professionals? So they're questions that could probably keep me going for the next 10 years, and hopefully with the collaboration of my colleagues here and in different places, that we'll be able to work on these research as a research agenda to go forward. So thank you, that's it, and I hope that has been useful and something that you can take away some thoughts that provoke your ideas about STEM education.
Cool.
Did I answer that question that you said at the beginning?
Yeah, it's good. So,
do you remember what it was?
It's not hard to see why she's a professor of STEM education, is it? This is a very smart person with really cool ideas, and one of the things I love embedded in what it means for teaching, which is really, in an education faculty, something that ought to matter. So a big deal. Time for take a few questions, Mandy?
Sure,
Happy for that? I'll let you choose.
Yeah, and I guess somebody's going around with a mic. Yep.
Maybe me.
Oh.
No, Chantal? Yep.
Chantal. And maybe there's people on, I don't know, if there's people online who want to ask a question. Oh, how dare. Right.
One with a question.
Don't be shy. Oh, this could be a plant.
I wish it was, actually. I should have thought of that beforehand.
Thank you, Mandy, for a thought-provoking conversation that you started. There are many questions I could ask, but I'm going to choose one that's sort of from the middle of the talk. You had a slide that talked about the need for shifts in conceptions about what constitutes subject matter. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think that we have some very traditional ways of thinking about what subject matter might be, and the inclusion, what I mean is about the inclusion of new kinds of knowledge in different subject fields and the connections between those different subject fields. So what I was talking about in relation to, so for instance, bioinformatics or whatever it happens to be, that is new kinds of ways of bringing knowledge together that we could be embracing and understanding more. So, yeah, and I mean, of course, there are components of knowledge that within subject discipline areas that are important. I'm not saying throw those things out of the window, yeah. Well, and so those foundational pieces of knowledge still become very important, but how do you connect those, or what, how are they connected to these new ways of thinking about knowledge and their different sort of boundaries, what exists there. So yeah, I'm definitely not saying throw those things out of the water. And I suppose what I'm arguing for in a way too is a kind of T-shaped teacher. We talk about T-shaped workers in the new economy, and a T-shaped teacher who still has a strong foundational knowledge but is able to connect that knowledge into different fields and in different places. So yeah.
Cool. Are you doing
now some questions online.
Online, here we go.
I actually don't think we've got enough time to answer all of the questions, Mandy, but
send them to her and she can email them.
Are coming in fast, so I might have to send that to you later. But we do have one from one of our onliners. If another group of STEM expertise is involved in teaching and developing, for example, a particular lesson or subject which is not actually that group's expertise, what approach would be taken? Will there be a certain pattern for this involvement?
Okay, so if I think I understand the question is about bringing people together to design STEM lessons or curriculum who don't have expertise in that area. Yep. Is that right? Yeah. Well, actually, I have a really nice example from a colleague, a New Zealand colleague who's about to start work next year here in the faculty, Jared Carpendale, who's been doing work in pedagogical content knowledge. And he was using those tools that we developed. There's scaffolds to bring together out-of-field teachers, so teachers who didn't have expertise in physics, with physics teachers to have conversations around these very things. So my response is, there are ways of bringing teachers together to have those conversations, but they require some structure and they require persistence and the development of some kind of language that teachers can share around the purposes and goals of that work. But what Jared had found over the couple of years of his PhD project was that became a very fruitful approach to be able to have conversations across experts and non-experts in their fields. So I think that's that one.
Time for one more? Yep, down the front here. Thank you. Thanks, Beck.
So a sort of core part of your presentation was this subject of change happening in the profession. Do you think that pre-service and graduate teachers are a better place to take advantage of this sort of change in discourse than current teachers? Or will they encounter that sort of power dynamic you mentioned?
It's a really interesting question. I think that teacher education institutions are in a great position to be able to support that kind of new learning, but it depends on the kinds of contexts that they go into as new teachers about whether or not they're able to enact those things. And so partly I think it becomes an important project of schools and universities working together to be able to socialise those new ideas. And sometimes it's around groups of teachers or pre-service teachers then having a little bit more kind of momentum because they're in that situation. I also think it's a sort of a stance of the teacher as well, because you could have a quite closed-minded pre-service teacher and a very open-minded experienced teacher who's very keen to change and develop. And I think from that inquiry project, we saw some really good examples of teachers who really wanted to change and other teachers who, as soon as the holidays came and then came back to their usual patterns of teaching. And so that was very difficult to make those shifts. But I think also opening up opportunities within schools for teachers to learn about, what's happening in these new fields. How do I get in touch with these contemporary practices and new ways of learning? And it's not always easy within the busy school day to get access. And in some ways, that map could be quite helpful in who do you bring in that you can share expertise with, as long as you don't become the passive bystander as the expert walks in and says, this is what STEM is all about, and the teacher gets sidelined. And I think that was an important point from that RMIT project about how you start to empower teachers. But I think it's individual to some extent, but that education institutions can be doing more to build that kind of knowledge and connection with schools.
Yeah, one more, Chantal, okay.
We had to get this one in because we've got quite a lot of people in Penang at the moment watching Mandy. I think the last time we got a head count of about 70, Mandy.
It's good that I didn't know.
Just to make you nervous. But one of the good questions we've got is, what incentive is there for traditional teachers to fit into STEM education?
Probably very little at the moment. Well, it depends where those traditional teachers are working, because if they're working in senior classes, then there's probably very little incentive, because those blocks of how currently school is set up with 8R, well, at least in the Australian context, so, you know, those the points scored at the end of your schooling becomes what drives teachers' practice for secondary, unless you're feel extremely able to move within that situation, and that's more difficult. But in terms of other teachers, there are some who may never want to change their practice, and I think you have to accept that. And at other times, I think there becomes some sort of mobilisation around what's happening in a school that can infect other teachers, that they want to get on board because it seems exciting, it seems something that you want to become involved with yourself. But again, I think that's about time, it's about positioning within the school, and it's about like the pervading school culture. And sometimes those external constraints, sometimes those curriculum constraints can really work in favour of a teacher who wants to maintain that traditional view or that traditional approach to teaching. And I'm not saying, again, it's not an either-or situation either, because sometimes you're drawing on traditional modes of teaching in order to be able to do certain things. So it's that combination of experiences that I think becomes important too.
Okay. So thank you very much to Mandy. Thank you for everybody for coming along, and the people that are online that I was supposed to have paid attention to at the beginning, to say thank you for the onliners, and a large number in Penang, but also a group at Peninsula who are setting themselves up in the future to actually be part of the streaming and to have the same opportunity to meet as a group together down there as we have up here when we run these things. So thank you everybody for your time and energy. Have a great end of year, and Mandy, thank you once again, very much appreciated.
Thanks, John.